We're returning to a historical topic first today, and then I want to discuss a particular social, political, religious, cultural conflict in the context of that historical situation. But first, let's back up and review a little bit of the history that we have talked about so far. It's been a little while since we discussed this. I have given you here a timeline from my accordance application. You may need to expand your screen to get to see all the detail. But what you see here is the timeline, which goes from the 8th century BC into the around 300 or so. And what's happening in this time period, these are all events that we've already discussed. So you have here in the years leading up to the last part of the 8th century, 721, this is the period in which Israel is destroyed by the Assyrians. And Judah down here continues under Assyrian vassalhood, under Assyrian domination, until eventually Babylon takes over from Assyria's imperial control, and Judah then becomes a vassal of the Assyrians. Starting around the year 600, then, going into the first couple of decades of the into the 6th century, in 597, then you have here it says the first deportation of Jews. That's when Nebuchadnezzar took the first group of Israelites from Jerusalem back to Babylon. And it's during that time period that the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel are working and writing. We discussed that before we got into the Torah. And then we have the period of the Babylonian exile, in which the significant portion of the Jews who live in Jerusalem have been taken to Babylon and are living in captivity. The most important thing that happens from a biblical point of view during the exile itself is the writing of so-called Second Isaiah, which is down here. And it's in Second Isaiah that we talked about that we find the first really pure philosophical expressions of monotheism and an expansion of the idea of God as Lord of history to God then as creator, and then a God who has a universal plan that encompasses all of the world and all of world history. So there is this really important theological thing that's happening in the exile, in which instead of being overwhelmed by events and giving in to the cultural pressure that would have been very normal during the period of Babylonian oppression, the Jews double down. They reaffirm their belief in God. They reaffirm their belief in God's power and providence, and see the power of God now defined as God the Creator, and God is the only God who exists in the universe, as the key to their salvation. And so you have in 2nd Isaiah, comfort my people, tell them that her penalty is paid, that she has already finished serving the sentence for her crimes, and I'm getting ready to restore her from her captivity. It's during the exile then that we turn to the history of the Pentateuch and the Torah. We talked about the creation narratives and the flood narratives, the power of the patriarchal stories and the Exodus stories and the wandering in the wilderness and the development of the Mosaic covenant as things that do have connections to other parts of Israel's history, but that can be interpreted as the literary expression of a people in exile, of a people under imperial domination. So the thing that I've been trying to do this entire semester here is really come to a head in the exile, which is to see these texts, which have a long history and do reflect a long history of editing and combination and redaction, to see these texts as the purified and distillated expression of Israel's hope and theological affirmations during the time of the Babylonian exile. Today, we are moving toward the end of the exile. What happens when the Babylonian exile has come to a conclusion? And as you see here on the list, what happens is that from about 550 to 500, Babylon gives way to Persia. The most important figure here is the Persian king of Cyrus. Cyrus takes over, sweeps up the remnants of the failing Babylonian Empire, and in 538 becomes the ruler of Babylon and cements the rising Persian Empire as the most powerful empire in the world. Well, Cyrus develops a different kind of imperial policy, and this is important to start. Whereas the Assyrians and the Babylonians had ruled in a very direct, very violent way, to say, you either do what we say or we're going to kill you, or we're going to move you and your family across the world, we're going to break up communities, we're going to burn down temples, we're going to destroy the civil infrastructure of these local communities that we are trying to dominate. The Persians came up with a different model, and I would argue that you could see the Persian Empire as the first really modern empire. What Cyrus and the Persian Empire develops over the course of the next couple of hundred years is an imperial model in which local communities are empowered to develop and maintain their own regional identities, to have their own law codes, to have their own local practices, to choose and empower local leaders under Persian authorization. The first act of this new, more maybe enlightened, but certainly more rhetorically and politically suave approach to imperial domination was the so-called Edict of Cyrus in the year 538. Cyrus sends home to their ancestral lands communities that had been displaced by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. We read about this in a text called the Cyrus Cylinder, which is in the British Museum, which you can go see if you are in London. And in the Cyrus Cylinder, which is a small little 10-centimeter inscription, we find the text of Cyrus's edict in which he says that he has been given control of Babylon by Marduk, that Marduk heard the cries of all the people and chose Cyrus. He called out his name Cyrus to be king over all the world. And he gave Cyrus all of these nations, including Babylon. And the people of Babylon bowed to him and kissed his feet and rejoiced at his kingship. When he came into Babylon, it says that he realized that there were people who were suffering all over the world, and he set about to free them from their bondage and to reestablish them and to prosper them in their local communities. And he says, I gathered all their inhabitants and returned to them their dwellings. In addition, at the command of Marduk, I settled in their habitations and pleasing abodes the gods of Sumer and Akkad, which Nabonidus had brought into Babylon. So what he's saying is he sends communities back home and also the statues of the gods back home to be restored to their temples. And he sees this as an act of incredible generosity. And the argument is that these gods and the people who serve those gods will then celebrate Cyrus as a good king, as a well-meaning king, as the one who blesses them, and then they will be more content to reign in peace. So the Cyrus Cylinder has been found. It does not mention the Jews specifically. However, the decree of Cyrus in Ezra 1, which you read, Ezra 1 and following, is a reference to this event, even though the Cyrus Cylinder itself doesn't mention the Jews. Notably, in the Cyrus Cylinder, Cyrus says that Marduk, the god of the Babylonians, chose him to be the savior of the Babylonians. And in Ezra, it says that the Lord, the God of the Israelites, chose Cyrus to be the deliverer of the Israelites. So even though the cultural, political perspective is different, they're both approaching it from the same central point of view. Here is an image of the Cyrus Cylinder. You can see, there it is. Cuneiform inscribed cylinder, an account of Cyrus the Great's conquest and restoration of the nations. So when the Persian Empire re-established all of these local communities under Persian control, rather than dominate them in every detail like the Babylonians had done before, the Persians said, if you agree to participate in the empire with regard to the things we care about, money, commerce, military, trade, general peaceableness of the kingdom, then you will be free to have local laws and local leaders who will settle your individual needs, who will deal with your individual situations. We are not going to rule over those directly in the same way that maybe it had been done before. This led to the Persian authorization of individual leaders and individual laws. And it is in this context that we interpret the final publication of and implementation of, to the extent that it was implemented, the Torah, the Pentateuch. That Ezra and Nehemiah and the other really important rulers and leaders who are priestly / government officials in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and Chronicles have been given the authority by the Persians to develop and publish, pronounce, implement, enforce local laws, which in this case would be more or less probably equal to the laws in the Pentateuch, in the Torah. So that's the good side of things. But there is a negative side. There are conflicts that are being set up in this process. Notice now we're talking about things that take place starting in 538 and then going through to about 500. The temple is being rebuilt and is finished by the end of that century. We now have a new temple in Jerusalem. Eventually the walls and the city of Jerusalem is being rebuilt and things are being restored. But this is 50 years or more, 50 to 70 years after the Babylonian exile took place in 587, 586. The people who are, quote unquote, returning from Babylon to Jerusalem are not the same people who left, by and large. They are the children and the grandchildren of those who left. And the people that they are encountering when they get back home are not the same people who were there who lived under the Babylonian invasion. They are the children and the grandchildren of those who lived during and through the Babylonian invasion. So you come walking up to the farm that your grandfather owned, and you find there another man, another family living on that farm. And you say, "This is my farm." And they say, "No, this is my farm." You say, "My father and grandfather owned this farm." And they say, "My father and grandfather owned this farm." Now we have conflict over economic control of resources. We have, in a larger sense, conflict over political control, legal control, religious control, cultural dominance. Conflict between the quote-unquote returnees, those who are coming from Babylon, and those who are the descendants of those who had been left a half a century before and are now part of a different cultural, political, and religious group. The Bible refers to that group of folks who were living in the land of Jerusalem and Judah during the exile as the people of the land. You see this designation all through the prophets and in the history and even in the Torah. The Bible is written by and from the perspective of the returnees. So they see this as restoration, that the exile is the aberration, the exile is the detour that is now being ended through the restoration into the post-exilic context, post-exilic period. They see the people of the land as the obstacle, as the enemy, as their partners in conflict over identity and resources. So here in Ezra 4, it says that there were adversaries of Judah who heard that the returned exiles were building a temple. And they came to Zerubbabel, who is the governor who's been appointed by the Persians, and they say, "Well, hey, let's build with you. We're going to worship with you. We've been worshiping here ever since all these bad things happened 50 to 100 years ago." And Zerubbabel said, "No, you shall have no part with us in building a house to our God. We alone will build to the Lord, as the king of Persia has commanded us." So this group of people who are asking to participate are part of a different community, and they are now being frozen out because the ones who are building the temple from Babylon, from Persian authorization, have they're holding all of the cards. They have all of the power. The people of the land are causing problems. They discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build, and they bribed officials, and they basically are causing all kinds of wrenches to come into the works of the attempt to rebuild the temple. So there's conflict, political conflict, religious, legal, cultural conflict between the so-called returnees and the so-called people of the land.